Viltrox just announced the new 35mm f1.2 full-frame lens, and I already have one. So let's talk about it. Now, the first thing that I want to talk about is the size and weight of this lens. It is beefy, it is a little bit heavy, but it's not so heavy and so beefy that you are going to feel overwhelmed using it on a long day. In terms of the Sony lens ecosystem, I would maybe compare it to the 50mm f1.2. I don't have that lens on hand, so I'm just kind of going off of memory, but in terms of weight, I don't have the specific numbers, but it is definitely heavier than my go-to 35mm f1.2 or f1.4 CZ lens. In terms of size, you can tell that it is beefier in terms of width. It's a little bit taller, and it has definitely got a bigger filter thread here. Going back to this 35mm f1.2 lens, it is within the Viltrox Lab series, which means it is of the highest quality that they offer. When you look back at some of the reviews for the 135mm f1.8, optically that lens was in comparison to the Sony 135 G-Master lens. So you know that Viltrox has the ability to compete or at least keep pace with some of the highest offerings from Sony. Now, in terms of build, this lens has everything that you would expect with any sort of modern lens. So it has the autofocus manual focus switch, it has a declicking switch, it has two custom buttons here on the side. Now, the thing about these custom buttons is there are some cool features and some not so cool features. Now, the cool features are that you can actually program these two buttons through the lens in order to set certain focus points. So if you are maybe a landscape photographer and you want to do some low light stuff where you're focusing on the stars and then you're gonna like focus stack and focus on something in the foreground, you can set those focus points so you don't have to like recompose or refocus. You just press a button, it'll focus on your pre-selected point. You press the other button, it'll focus on the other one. Now, the not so cool part about these buttons is that currently with this pre-production model, I don't have the ability to go to the Sony menu and program both of these buttons. My camera body only recognizes a single button. Now, there may be some ways to customize these through the Viltrox app, but currently this is my only Viltrox lens, and because it's a pre-production lens, it is not supported by the app just yet, so I'm not sure what sort of customizations or functionalities that app unlocks. I do know that you can use the app for things like firmware updates, which is nice, or the lens also has a USB-C port built into the part of the lens that attaches to the body, so you can actually just plug this into the computer if you would like to update it that way as well. Now, circling back to the build, this lens has an aperture ring. Now, this lens doesn't have any sort of markings on what aperture you have selected. That's because this ring will just infinitely scroll in both directions, because the screen is actually what's going to tell you the aperture. Now, the cool thing about this is that this screen will light up, and so in low light situations, you can actually read it very well. But that said, using something like this lens where it has markings on the actual lens, I never had any sort of issue reading that in low light. You can always look at the screen of your camera to see what the aperture setting is as well. So I don't think I am a huge fan of this aperture ring and screen implementation, and primarily that's because in order to make an aperture change, you now have to have your camera turned on, and I find myself a lot of the times adjusting my aperture while the camera is off, as sort of like I'm setting up to shoot a set of images with a low depth of field or a high depth of field. I can just set that as I'm walking around analyzing a room and things like that. Whereas now I need to make those changes with the camera body turned on. The other issue I have, and again, this is a pre-production model, so I'm hoping that this is fixed with production units or possibly able to fix this specific lens with a firmware update. But I found that when the camera is set to f1.2, even just a little bit of pressure on the ring without actually making any sort of click to the next aperture, I found that the lens is changing from 1.2 to 1.3. And at first I thought that this is because I was bumping the lens, because when I took a set of images that I thought I was at 1.2, when I got back to the computer, I noticed a good set of them were at 1.3. And so I just thought I bumped it. But when I was testing and taking some footage of the lens, I found that even just a little bit of pressure on this ring changed the aperture. Similarly, I found situations where a click on the aperture ring didn't actually change the aperture. So there are times where one click will make a change, and then there are times where you need 2 clicks to make a change. And then I even found situations where it needed 3 clicks to make a change. And this isn't something that I find to be consistent where, changing from f1.2 to 1.3 requires 2 clicks, and then 1.8 to 2 requires 1 click. It's kind of random. So I have a feeling that maybe whatever mechanism is inside the lens that's reading these clicks isn't picking up all of the clicks. And so it's weird that it's overly sensitive in some situations and then not sensitive enough in others. Okay, so I'm not even clicking. It's just a slight pressure and it stays at 1.3, but if I put a little bit of pressure, 1.2, and it stays there, 1.3 and it stays there. All right, and then I just clicked and it stayed at 1.3, click 1.4, click, still 1.4, click 1.6, 2 clicks, still 1.6, finally 1.8, 2.0, 1 click, still 2.0, 1 click, still 2.0, now 2.2, 1 click, still 2.2, 2.5, still 2.5, 2.8, still 2.8, 3.2, 3.2, 3.2, 3.5, still 3.5, 4, 4, 4.5, 4.5, still 4.5, 5.0. But again, pre-production model, so I'm hoping that this gets changed or fixed. And I haven't seen anybody mention this with any of the previously released Viltrox lenses like the 135 or the 16. So I'm hoping that that gets changed. Now, in terms of optics, I'm not someone that is overly critical with my, my lens optic characteristics. I just care that it is good and it's not like overly soft, or that the bokeh isn't super crazy. And I feel like this lens is as good or better than most lenses that I've tried. So when it comes to things like distortion, I don't have any sort of, lens correction for Lightroom because there's nothing built into the lens, and Lightroom obviously doesn't support the lens either. But looking just at the raw file, the distortion seems totally manageable. There's a little bit of bending here on the edge. I'm not familiar with all of the different terminologies for distortions, but this seems like something that's going to be easily fixed with lens correction. And in terms of modern mirrorless lenses, I feel like a lot of the modern mirrorless lenses have way more distortion on a raw file than this Viltrox has. So that's a great thing. Now, when it comes to flare, there is noticeably more flare at 1.2 compared to 1.4. And then as you go down, obviously, that gets better and better. For me, I like having the ability to have more flare. I feel like that gives images a little bit more characteristic. Again, I'm not shooting like overly critical landscapes or things like that where I want to have as little flare as possible. I actually enjoy a little bit of these like optical imperfections in my lenses. And this kind of carries through the other aspects of this lens. So like the sun stars, I feel like the sun stars are nice. They're not overly interesting, but they're not overly clinical. I feel like they're a good balance of being cool with some like nice streaking and things like that. When it comes to the bokeh is what you would think from a f1.4, f1.2 lens. When you get closer to the edges, you will see a little bit of cat's eyeing at 1.2. That goes away around f1.8, f2, 1.2, 1.4, 1.8, 2. And again, for me, I actually kind of like a little bit of those optical imperfections, and so I enjoy having that, especially because it goes away so quickly when you dial down again to like 1.8 f2. Now, in terms of the difference between going from 1.2 to 1.4, I actually can't tell much of a difference in terms of depth of field when I compare an image taken at 1.2 and an image taken at 1.4. And to me, the vignetting difference between 1.2 and 1.4 is so much more noticeable that it's hard for me to actually see any sort of difference in terms of depth of field. So keep that in mind. I don't know if you necessarily need to buy a 1.2 lens for that added depth of field. Now, obviously, you will be gathering a little bit more light, and so you will be able to shoot at a lower ISO if you're shooting at really low light conditions. But in terms of trying to get like that even shallower depth of field, for me, I can't really tell that much of a difference between 1.2 and 1.4. Now, comparing the 1.2 to 1.4, I'm curious if you can tell the difference. So between these two images, one is at f1.2, the other one is at f1.4. And when we place them side by side, it almost appears that there is an exposure difference. But if I zoom in onto the lens, you'll be able to tell that the lens is actually the same exposure. But when we zoom out, it looks like there's a little bit of an exposure difference, and that's simply because of the vignetting. But placing these two images side by side, I'd be curious to tell if you can tell the difference between the 1.2 and the 1.4. But you can tell the difference in terms of the vignetting. And so if you are going to place a subject up in the top corner, you might want to keep in mind that it is going to be a little bit darker up there just due to the vignetting. Okay, so editor's note here real quick. I was trying to retake some of my example images for the vignetting, and I noticed something a little bit peculiar. As I'm going from f1.2 to 1.3 and then to 1.4, the vignetting does get better. But I saw something that was a little bit interesting, and that's that you actually get a dark spot in the center of the frame. Now, it becomes apparent at 1.3, and then it gets even worse at f1.4. And then as you go up from 1.4 up into the f2 range, the vignetting continues to get better, and then that dark circle goes away. But I did find it interesting that as you go from 1.2 to 1.4, as the vignetting gets better, the center of the frame actually gets worse. But just something to keep in mind. And again, pre-production lens, no profile corrections. So hopefully as Lightroom supports this lens, profile corrections will take away any sort of these weird abnormalities. But just want to let you know. Now, in terms of sharpness, the sharpness of this lens is fantastic. And for me, in terms of sharpness, I am more than willing to place a subject way up in the top corner, because from center to corner, the sharpness is great and more than usable. Obviously, the center is a little bit sharper, holds a little bit more contrast than you find on the edges when you're shooting at f1.2. But even at 1.2, I think that the sharpness and contrast results up in the corners are more than usable, and I would be totally happy framing a subject way up in a top corner or bottom corner for, a little bit more interesting compositions. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about is autofocus. So obviously this is an autofocus lens, and autofocus on Sony cameras is so amazing that when I throw on the Viltrox, it is still really good, but it is, I wouldn't even say it's overly noticeable that it's slower, but it isn't up to speed in terms of a G-Master focus speed. But there's still never a situation where I found the lens to be slow or hunting for focus or missing focus or things like that. So it's hard for me to even just put it into terms of what the differences actually are, because it is slower than a G-Master lens, but it's still way above my experience with, things like even the latest Canon autofocus or Fuji autofocus or Nikon autofocus or things like that. So again, A little bit slower than what you might be used to with a high-end G-Master lens, but still better than the rest of the competition. So that's all I have for this first look at the 35mm f1.2 lab lens from Viltrox. Hopefully you guys found this useful. If you would like to see more content from me, I would love for you to hit the subscribe button, as well as drop me a like, comment. This is a newer YouTube channel, so obviously that stuff is very helpful for me. If you want to see some more of my premium content, make sure to head over to my Patreon account, and I'd also love for you to follow me over on Instagram. So with that, I'll see you on the next one.